Welcome to the third season of the What's Your Story podcast with your host, Ron Coughlin. This podcast dives into the exciting world of AI for marketers. Each episode, we chat with some of the top marketing leaders and educators who are using AI to transform their strategies. Get ready to discover how AI is revolutionizing marketing and learn how you can leverage these powerful tools to help grow your business and career. We look forward to you joining us for an exciting discussion each week about the power of AI.
Hi, everybody. This is Ron Coughlin for the What's Your Story podcast. This is our third season, as you know. And in this season, we have refocused our efforts around an amazing topic and one that's disrupting the whole marketing world, which is AI. And today I have an exciting guest, one that I was introduced to actually through his book called 6 Pixels of Separation about 10 years ago, Mitch Joel. So welcome, Mitch. Thank you for joining us here today on the podcast.
Happy to be here, Ron. Thanks for the invite.
So Mitch is actually a great guest to have on our podcast today because he is a leader in the digital world, but also in how AI is affecting companies and leaders, and he's got a perspective about that. But Mitch, why don't you start us off by just giving us a perspective of who you are, what you've been doing. You're quite accomplished. You're a speaker. You're an author. You own a company, and you've been the chair of the Marketing Association Canadian. So very excited to have you on here today. So welcome, and that story would be a great way to get us started here.
It's a long and windy tale. As I say in my second book, Control Alt Delete, it was a very squiggly path. So professionally, I started in the late 80s as a music journalist, interviewing people like Tommy Lee from Motley Crue and Metallica and Bon Jovi. And it was a very fun and exciting time. I was working for the Weekly here in Montreal, where I live, the Alternative Weekly. I had my own magazines that I was publishing. I was doing a lot of stuff in the States. Tangentially, the same time, I came from a middle-class family, 4 boys. And I think what my parents very astutely did is they gave us a piece of technology as a way to share, which would encourage us to actually try and work together, play together. It wound up leading to fights, but that was the strategy. So in the early 80s, I had the Atari 2600 that evolved to the Atari 800. And I always had this fascination with technology and just computers and desktop computers. I remember being one of the first, having a friend who was one of the first home computers, and people would say, "What do you need this for?" And I was like, "What don't you need this for?" And I was really, really young at the time. So you have to imagine this sort of tangential life where I'm constantly tinkering with new types of technologies and upgrading and even building home computers and for myself and getting early days of modem and connectivity. And at the same time, I'm fascinated with music and media and that world. And so I wound up publishing magazines, and these magazines were pre-internet. In fact, in the early 90s, we had a cover story on one of the magazines called The Net. And the big innovation at the time was hyperlinks, the fact that you didn't have to type in each web page into a full URL. You could click and go to another web page. So very early days of that. Yeah. And we talked about the potential of this amazing thing, and knock on wood, it did work out. And so from there, I worked at a local newspaper magazine that was trying to encourage young people to stay in Montreal and to build a life here, because we have the whole French English thing happening here as well. And through that, I met these very young people that were working on something called a meta search engine. And the idea was, at the time, no Google yet, that a lot of these search engines just didn't have great results. But if you took all of them together and tried to create one result, it could work. And it worked very, very well. And so I'd written an article about them. They'd reached out to me to potentially work with them. I didn't even know what they meant by online ads, but I guess they saw what I was doing with traditional media and figured if he could sell ads there, he could sell them here. And this was a very fascinating journey, because we wound up establishing a lot of the business models that we now see as these trillion-dollar businesses from, now it's Google AdWords, but back then the idea of letting people auction or pay for a spot in a search engine was unknown, and we were developing these platforms. So really interesting to be a part of that. I did a small stint for a mobile content company, which again, you think, well, what does that mean? At the time, there wasn't even interoperability between carriers, meaning if you were on Sprint and I was on Verizon, I couldn't even text message you. And this company's 2 people that I knew very well here in Montreal had this vision that soon you would actually engage with content, not just text, on these mobile devices. And of course, that became a true thing. I did a small stint back at owning a record label with a business partner in Toronto. And in 2000, things really changed for me when I joined this digital agency called Twist Image. At the time, it wasn't even a digital agency, but we had this vision, and it was myself and two business partners. We eventually added a fourth, and we had a great run from about 2000 on. We built this agency to have offices in Montreal and Toronto. We had international as well as national clients. We started blogging and podcasting in the early 2000s, so very much ahead of the curve. Still have the podcast, wrote books, was speaking. We wound up selling that business to WPP, which is one of the largest marketing communications companies in the world. But even in that journey, I was doing a lot of public speaking, and I had been engaged by two speaking bureaus to do that prior to the book, but the books, both of them really helped. And so sold the business about 5 or 6 years ago now. When I left, the decision was made with myself and one of my business partners that I would continue to speak and do media and do my podcast and create all sorts of stuff. We've been doing some great investing, which has been a lot of fun. And then about a year and a bit ago, we launched a new startup called Thinkers One, which is just a way for companies to buy bite-sized and personalized thought leadership from some of the best thinkers in the world. So think of it as like a Cameo meets Masterclass, but it's B2B and it's shot really, really well. And I just, I tinker a lot with this stuff, obviously, and the advent of AI, which is something I've been following for 10 plus years. But to see that pivotal moment where OpenAI launches ChatGPT and we see a commercialization path and a product, that changed a lot. And I find myself now doing a lot of keynotes on generative AI. And so I'm happy you reached out, Ron, and I apologize for the long-winded story, but it's not as simple as I'm in marketing. Okay. Yeah.
Well, no better to have someone like yourself on this podcast. We've had some great guests so far. And one question I want to start us off on is that, if you think about AI and, it's really having a disruptive, path, or it's kind of revolutionizing marketing right now. What do you see is happening out there, and some things to really watch out for in the business world?
Yeah, I think there's almost three things that are the big themes, right? Theme one is this artificial intelligence? My running joke, and you're in marketing too, is it's the Hakuna Matata moment of AI. It's like AI is everything the sun touches is AI. And so I think for leaders, the number one thing is actually figuring out within that world where everyone's hyping these tools is this really AI? And I think tangentially attached to that is the notion of like, what actually is AI? I was very struck by an article in Inc. magazine a while ago that I have as one of my slides in my keynote presentation. And the title is something like, is it AI or just computers doing stuff that computers do? Right. And it's an interesting thought. And so that would be like one is like, is this AI? So then if we go to next, it's like, so what is AI? I would define artificial intelligence as a code, an algorithm, a program that you can give it an instruction, and without giving it further instructions of how to do it, it can not only create it on its own, but then explain back to you how it did it. That to me is pure artificial intelligence. And I do think that that's the delineation between AI and computers doing what computers do. So with that, I might argue that a lot of the stuff we're seeing isn't really artificial intelligence. And I say that to go to the third point, which is because we've have this new term called generative AI. Now, I know a lot of the purists don't like to bifurcate the two. They don't want to split the two up. They want to say it's the same thing. I don't think it is. I think for generative AI, I would argue that it's a code, it's an algorithm, it's a program. But what generative AI is doing is taking existing databases, usually large ones, they call these large language models, whatever it might be, and it's able to, based off of all the data it has in it, predict or create a new result from it. So it's not pure in the sense of it's doing it all on its own and learning how to do it and explaining back, but it's able to take a vast swath of information, create something uniquely new out of it. So when you say, what is the big thing? I would argue that in the bucket of generative AI, we're seeing just an explosion of things happen. It would be the ability to create text, images, audio, video, manipulate data, Excel files, Sheets files, create its own programming and coding. Very, very interesting as well. So when you think about that from a marketing standpoint, you can kind of extrapolate out of that. how big and vast the opportunity is. And within that, you have I would say two camps. One camp is this is a very, very dangerous and could destroy us all. And then the other camp is, it's predictive guessing that has a very cool web interface, but isn't even as good as Google on a bad day.
Right.
I would argue that it's very, very impressive. I would argue to say that this is the same as any other disruption we've had, from steam engines to publishing to the internet, would be a misnomer. And I would also say that if executed well, and there's no indications that it won't progress quickly down this path, it might solve for work and it might solve for productivity, which creates a moment in time where as humans, we have to reconcile the idea of living with a super intelligence and at the same time figuring out what matters to us. We see this all the time. People, they retire and they don't know what to do because who they are is tied to what they do. Mm-hmm. Now imagine a world where we don't have to work or be productive in that sense. Who are we? And that can lead to a very opportunistic moment, think Star Trek, or it could lead to a very perilous situation, think high unemployment, rise of extremism, things like that. And I believe that is the real concern for those who should be concerned.
Yeah, you make some really good points here. And I think one of the things that also is coming up is who is deciding what the answers are in AI. So the idea of risk as well as security, and also thinking about trusting it. So how can people trust it, do you think? Do you think it's something that people are grasping with, or is this something that everybody's not too sure about? So what do you think about this idea of trusting AI and where it's coming from?
I mean, we could remove the word AI, Ron, and we could say, how do we trust others? How do we trust organizations? How do we trust government? How do we trust businesses? And I would argue that that word trust has been at the forefront, almost the apex predator of marketing conversations now for what is almost 3 decades, because the democratization of access to media created a space where things became very transparent and trust became true. What's that Stephen Colbert line, truthiness, or whatever it might be, or Jon Stewart, or what have you. So when I think about trust and AI, I almost erase the AI component and just look at the idea of how do we trust. The trust becomes very complex because you would say trust is going to be a tenet of culture. Now we start going into, well, what is culture? So if suddenly you have some type of culture that is developing the super intelligence, but that culture isn't aligned with your culture, it could be religiously, it could be sexual preference, it could be by race, it could be by geography, it could be by age. We can never expect there to be a unified level of trust or culture in it. Not that that means we need to then stand back and think, well, what is this? But you have the creators of this, people like Sam Altman from OpenAI and others, talking about not just an existential risk, but an extinction level risk. So what can we do? Well, the easy answer is government and regulation. But I would argue that government and regulation historically has done a lot of good. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think it's protected citizens at a complete level. So when you step down from that, you go, what do we do? Well, the answer is self-preservation. And I do think that self-preservation in this instance is very tenable and workable because all it requires is education and effort. So if you can self-educate and look at it, like I'll give you a great example. One of the biggest complaints we hear about generative AI is the fact that it hallucinates, it makes mistakes. And people then go, well, I can't trust it. I would argue I'm not using it for that. I'm not using it to generate facts. I'm using it to help me be better at the work that I do. I'm using it to push ideas forward. And so if I'm using it at that level, that doesn't become a factor for me. So I'm not trusting it for facts. I'm able to use it to augment my thinking right now, more of as a co-pilot than a replacement. So this is where things start getting interesting, where when people ask me, like, how do we trust it? The answer is, look, government's going to have to step up. the leaders of these organizations are going to be transparent about how it's being coded and programmed, how it's being used, which is problematic because they themselves often don't know when it goes and does what it does. But ultimately, I think we are going to have to self-preserve ourselves. We're going to have to inoculate ourselves. We're going to have to get more literate. If you said to me, Mitch, put aside AI, and what was the most confusing part of the social media era, I would argue that it was people not being literate enough, and you're running free and loose with tools. And that created a lot of the chaos from, just overemphasis on our own importance and sharing and oversharing to the erosion of a certain level of democracy politically because of how these channels went. If everybody was more literate with it, it would have been different. And that's the reality of the platforms.
Yeah, I think you're right. So if I was a young marketer and I was trying to make my way in the world today, my son is actually a young marketer, and luckily he got a great job with an up and coming group called the Influence Group. But what kind of advice would you give to them in terms of tools they need to learn, or education, or other things that they need to be aware of when they are starting off now and trying to get a career going and everything else?
It depends on what we say when we mean a career in marketing, because I think the creative aspect is very different from the technical aspect, which is very different from the management side and admin side, which is very different from client services. So again, we tend to do this a lot. It's almost like the way we mistakenly confuse advertising for marketing when we talk about those two things, which are very different. So if you were to say to me, hey, he is a very creative individual, the answer is really clear, which is you're going to need to get much more astute at these tools. Because the truth of it is if you're not using these tools, you're going to get left behind. If you are using these tools, you may be facing your own self-evisceration eventually, because the better it gets and the more the agency or brand that you work with can use these tools, the less they're going to need you. And so I think the real answer to the question is almost like a reverse way of thinking about it. So I'll give you the problem that we have. The problem that we have right now and the fear that we have is that for the first time in society, these tools are coming for knowledge workers. We've never seen that before. What's a knowledge worker? I'd argue primarily this is somebody with an advanced degree somewhere, graduated college, university. I didn't. I happened to luck through and squeak my way through. You're talking about someone who has risen to a certain level of respect, which could be salary, title, whatever within the industry. Now we talk about what's the work that they do. I would argue, and I reflect on my days of agency, what made the work function is the fact that I would do something for client A, learn a lot from them. They would pay me for that as well. And I could replicate that for client B, C, D, and E. The problem with that is exactly what this level of AI can eat for breakfast. It does it exceptionally well. Taking something of a high level, repeating it, and creating original output forward based off of industry's project, whatever, AI does very well. So to answer the question in a long-winded way, my answer to your son would be, or daughter, I don't know what it is, it would be, you essentially want to ensure that the work you're doing isn't something that's repetitive. You want to constantly figure out, what can I do to both use these tools to make me better at it, but at the same time ensure in the work that it is not a constant repetition. And because that is the ascension to the career, I think those days are long gone now. They're going to be longer gone very, very soon, because I also believe that the mid-time, the next year to 3 years, is going to be the most dramatic. And so you need to weather yourself through that. And I believe the antidote is to think about your work in a non-repetitive way. Leverage the tools to enhance that and push that forward. If not, that's going to be the problem for many professionals. Now, the caveat here is, in terms of your child, is I feel really bad for them. And I feel really bad for them because I can tell you, as someone who's using these tools day in and day out, what I would call from a marketing output, meaning I'm either creating content, media, marketing materials, whatever it might be, text, images, audio, video, programming, etc., that it's already much more advanced than entry level, and I would even argue getting, once you get good at it, to mid level. That's really problematic because you have a swath of young people trying to come into an industry where they're not necessarily needed. The problem with it, in particular with the marketing industry, is that it's very hard to get good at this industry without getting those entry level jobs. That is the conundrum that the industry has yet to address, and they haven't addressed it. I would like to see them address it. I don't know that the answer is good or pleasurable or nice, but the truth of the matter is, to hire a junior copywriter today, you would have to be insane, because the way in which you can already manipulate a platform like ChatGPT or Claude is already significantly better than that level for a couple of years right now. And as you use it, it scales very quickly.
Yeah, I think you're right. So one of the things that I've done in one of my classes is we introduce a bunch of tools, and we have a lab. And the lab is, the idea is to pick a tool and then create, we usually have them pick a tool that can create a video ad of some type. And basically what happens is I ask them to, in groups of 4, to create this tool, create an ad from it, of any brand they want. A couple criteria would be they have to make sure it is an ad, that it has an opening and ending, an offer of some type. And I give them about an hour to do it. And then they have to come back and they have to present it to the class. What I get is unbelievable, to be honest. The quality, and it depends on the individual, but
of course.
But one group that I had, and actually, I'm actually hiring her as an intern, but it looked like a produced ad that you would pay for, and it's truly unbelievable. So quite interesting that way. But the thing that they all said was human intervention, I should say, is critical when they're developing these ads. You can't just feed it and then hopefully you get an ad. So,
Ron, I'm going to stop you there only because I believe that to be true in what I call the virgin models. The virgin model is, you tell them to do this, they open up Claude or ChatGPT and they go through a process. If you have been building any form of content, let's say on ChatGPT, we'll use that as an example. One is, you have the ability to tell it the type of person you are and the type of voice you like to use as a baseline for every process it will generate. You then have the ability to create different AIs, bots, for different activities. So for example, I don't have one in my ChatGPT. I have one for titles. I have one for radio talking points. I have one for bios for the podcast that I do every week. Like I have one for social media, but social media for this versus social media for that. And as it does it, and as you are reinforcing it, even by saying to it, thanks for that, here's my final, remember that style, I would say in a very short period of time, I've elevated it to the point where I'm editing it versus I get it back and it requires a lot of human. I think that misnomer is only a misnomer very recently. Mm-hmm. And again, it speaks to the speed of which these things have been getting better, and through both reinforcement and how I'm creating these prompts and using these prompts, the output I'm getting. So my outputs, I would argue, require very little intervention, and we're getting pretty close to it getting it almost right. Yeah, it'll hallucinate. I mean, there's always that part. I mean, of course. So I'm not trying to say it's the replacement of it, but I'm always cautious of the things I heard at the beginning of AI and generative AI tools to where we are now, to say, if those students had been working with those chatbots from day one, really understanding when you gave the assignment, I'd probably argue they would be able to do it with much less intervention or human than we might think, which doesn't mean it doesn't. It just means that it's at a different level now. So it's just an important nuance to be aware of.
Very true. Now, if you're thinking about 5 years from now, where do you think this is all going? Do you think we're going to be in a different place, or we're going to be in a more advanced place, or a disruptive place? What do you think?
Yes. I think we will be very close. the first thing we have to know is there is something called AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is when we can identify that it is a superior intelligence to the one we have. And there's all sorts of questions about, has it even already happened with just a chat GPT? Why? Because chat GPT was able to pass the Turing test, which is the ability to fool someone else into knowing it's a computer or a human. So we already passed that milestone a while ago. And, one is we don't talk about it, which is kind of frightening. But essentially, these tools can already fool a human into thinking that it's another human. So we've done that. So now the question becomes, will it become more intelligent to us? Here's my subtle nuance argument, because people like Nick Bostrom, who's a brilliant philosopher, would be much more delineated in how they see it. My argument is, who cares? If it can already fool us through predictive trickery, or it's actually smarter than us, does it matter? Does it matter? If it's already fooling us, it's already fooling us, right? So when we talk about things like the near short term, and 5 years doesn't even seem that near, but I think it would be dramatic for this, is we could be at a place where we have solved for a lot of the work that knowledge work takes. It could be a place where agents are speaking to agents. So the only thing you're ultimately seeing is like a weird result of a filter to a filter conversation. Now, all of these things are very possible. And I don't say that to scare people. I don't say that to create hyperbole or hyper anything like that. It's more from the standpoint of, one, we have no idea, but the level of which it's able to disrupt how we think about work and what work is and how we value work is going to be very dramatic. My other little nuance to that is, I believe, haven't been proven, but I think it's possible, is that should it be able to achieve these scales shortly, and I believe that it will force us to have a level of humility, meaning we might realize that as complex as the brain is and how humans are at the top of the food chain, we actually run in very simple systems, and we're actually very, very simple, and our brains are very simple. That would be very traumatic for society, but I think that that's what we're going to see very quickly.
Very cool. Now, your new company, Thinkers One, you're creating video content, I understand. And how is AI involved with that? Are you using AI or
Yeah. So the truth is, I don't know. And what I mean by I don't know is, it's a platform that it's basically a marketplace that enables thought leaders to sell mid-tier video content to people. Okay. Do I use generative AI tools to come up with better and compelling topics, to use it to market it, to talk about it? Do I use it in the content creation of the support of things, my podcast and beyond? Absolutely, yes, yes, and yes. Is the platform on which it's built on, does it have generative AI tools to help the programming and building of it work more effectively? It's built on Shopify. The answer is yes. We know that Shopify has been deploying a whole bunch of technology behind the scenes. So again, I don't know if I'm in the Hakuna Matata moment of AI is everything the sun touches. But yeah, the answer I think would be, as both the founder, co-founder of the company, and someone who's on the platform, again, going back to everything we've spoken to, is I use it a lot. I would be remiss to not think that other thought leaders weren't using it for the same reasons. If they're not, I would hope that they would, because it would be the smart thing to do. And again, I think that this is the part of it that a lot of people can't wrap their head around, the fact that it's going to impact every aspect of it. So if I think about it, like, how do we think business wise? Well, we talk in strategy. I have a strategy bot. How do we talk about like what the customer sees? Well, I have bots that help me create better content for that. Well, how do I market and communicate? Well, I have bots that it's almost like it touches every angle of it. So it's not like, are you using it? Are you not? Back office, we might use this for things like accounting. We might look, on and on and on. So the answer to me is obviously yes, yes, and yes. But how we see it might be more invisible, in the sense of the way I hear the question sometimes, not in this case, is, do you use electricity in your business, type of thing? It's like, I would never even like, why, of course, I guess so. Yeah, things are lit and I'm speaking to you and it's plugged into a wall. I believe that is maybe not the current state for everybody. It's definitely something we think about, but I think it would be that underlying component of it, like a utility.
Very good. Well, listen, thank you, Mitch, for joining us today. And if someone wanted to get a hold of you or contact your organization, how would they do that? A lot of
You know,
people ask me that.
I appreciate it, Ron. Thinkersone.com if they want to check out the platform. Otherwise, if you just go to 6pixels or mitchjoel.com, you'll find all of my incessant content creations and thinkings and conversations around this space. And it was great to connect. And thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. And you listen, you have a great rest of your week. And we'll be focusing this podcast in the next couple of weeks as we schedule it in. So thank you very much. And if you're following us, please make sure to subscribe, follow us, share the podcast, and you all have a great day. Thank you very much.